The current state of the world has been riddled with violence. Many accounts of racial violence has shaken our nation and the globe. In hard times like these, peace is something the world always yearns for. We hope for peace because it gives us a sense of being safe, and it is a big goal to be moving towards.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal.
Many have worked tirelessly towards equality in peaceful ways. The first person that comes to mind when you say nonviolent protest is Mahatma Gandhi. Racial segregation instigated many peaceful protests. Two of the most famous nonviolent protesters joined the fight due to one policy: apartheid, meaning apartness in Afrikaans. Apartheid was a system that institutionalized the separation of groups descending from the English, African, Indian, and Dutch. To understand the effects of apartheid, we must first look back at the history of Africa. European tradesmen began setting outposts in Africa as a resting spot on their way to India in the 1500s. Soon, this developed into a situation where European settlers began to expand their territory, and the underpaid English middle class began to migrate to South Africa. Natives were losing their natural rights, and the Indians were compelled to work as non-paid laborers in gold and diamond mines, where their safety was at a massive risk. After beginning their dominion on African soil, the British set racial boundaries between the Europeans and the colored Boers. The British even went as far as to ban the use of the Dutch language, which sparked the Boer Wars of 1899 to 1902. Even with the Boers' brilliant hit-and-run tactics and the rather fumbling British army built for traditional combat, the war resulted in British supremacy in South Africa. This apartheid expanded the rights of the English minority and brought down the rights of the African majority, the Boers and Indians in Africa. Gandhi was one of the witnesses to the effects of apartheid. He had a good upbringing and moved to South Africa after he got a job in a major Indian law firm. It was supposed to be a short stay for Gandhi, but it was extended due to one thing: racial discrimination. On June 7, 1893, he was ejected from a train in South Africa despite having a first-class ticket, simply because an Englishman complained that an Indian was sitting next to him. Indians faced similar discrimination elsewhere as well. They were brought to Africa on 5-year contracts to work as indentured laborers and reap the rewards afterward in the form of housing in Africa. Soon these rewards started to fade away when these workers gained residence and established their roots. The primary white government began setting laws that would limit Indian growth when they feared the rise of Indian power in South Africa. A wave of laws made non-Christian marriages illegitimate, which meant most Indian marriages were invalidated, and their children could not gain inheritance. Additionally, the government established a 3-pound tax on Indians to force them to return to India. This pivotal movement compelled Gandhi to establish the Natal Indian Congress on August 22, 1894, which would fight to protect the rights of the Indians in South Africa. He also instigated the Satyagraha, or Holding On to Truth March, in 1907, the first of the many. Gandhi held a peaceful protest instead of direct violence because the vindication of truth, not by infliction of suffering on the opponent but on oneself. This milestone march was against the new laws from the mainly white government located in the Transvaal region that restricted the rights of Indians even further. The Satyagrahis would not follow the discriminatory laws and would take any punishment forced on them. During the first wave of protests, a total of 3,000 Satyagrahis were thrown in jail. Despite the suspension of Satyagraha marches in 1911 for peace negotiations, the failure of said talks led to the continuation of the marches in 1913. Gandhi was a catalyst among the separate communities living in Africa to come together and fight for their denied rights peacefully. He left South Africa after the discriminatory laws were lifted. Those who bravely followed Gandhian principles carried his message even after his departure from Africa. Gandhi held many satyagraha marches in India as part of the Indian independence movement when he left Africa after a 21-year fight. Meanwhile in India, the conditions of the Indians were even worse, as they worked for the gain of the British. All their hard work would be reinvested into the British Empire, leaving Indians in poverty. Over 4 million Indians joined the army during the World Wars, as they saw this as their only option for income. They believed that if they won, the British Raj would grant India its freedom. But it remained a dream, and at least 170,000 soldiers lost their lives. When Gandhi returned to India in 1915, Gandhi led his second satyagraha, called the Nonviolent Non-Cooperation Movement, that encouraged the Indians to boycott British goods, leave British jobs, and not follow British laws, all to obtain freedom. But as this movement grew, uniting all Indians despite caste and religious borders, the Rowlatt Act of 1919 was created to limit Indian interaction. By this act, anyone could be arrested based on suspicion alone, and no meeting could be held with more than 4 people. This act came to its horrifying conclusion with the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. A peaceful crowd had assembled in Amritsar for the annual Baisakhi festivals when an armed troop of British soldiers entered, blocking the only exit, opening fire, and killing more than 1,500. The Jallianwala Bagh massacre only strengthened Indian patriotism as Gandhi and his followers began uniting multiple independence movements into one singular movement. But during a procession in Gorakhpur, violence broke out, killing 3 protesters and 22 policemen. This sudden break of violence led to Gandhi withdrawing from the movement. Eventually, more peaceful protests sprung up in its place, and even the Mahatma himself joined again. He learned of the unethical taxation of salt, as the Rowlatt Act was not the only unfair law brought by the British Raj. They also enforced laws that prohibited Indians from producing their salt, but also forced them to buy British-made salt, which had a high tax. In retaliation, Gandhi organized the Dundee March, where he and 80 others began their march from the Gandhi ashram in Sabarmati, near Ahmedabad, to the Gujarat town of Dundee, which met with the Arabian Sea. Along the way, more than 5,000 people joined the march, which ended with Gandhi collecting the salt from the sea. This march was instrumental, not only because it connected many, but also because it inspired similar marches across the country. At the end of the Salt Satyagraha march, he exclaimed that with the salt grains they collected, they would shake the British government's core. The final nail in the coffin was the Quit India movement. Gandhi's historic do-or-die speech gathered all of India to demand the immediate transfer of power from the British Raj. The British government was unable to handle these movements and gave India its independence in 1947.
Do you subscribe to that judgment of Gandhi, or would you disavow violence under any conditions?
Now, in that instance, I would agree with Gandhi that if the only alternative to violence, to fear, is violence and vice versa, then I would say fight, but it isn't the only alternative.
There are many people who feel that it is useless and futile for us to continue talking peace and nonviolence against a government whose reply is only savage attacks on an unarmed and defenseless people.
The thoughts and actions of the leaders of the Indian independence movement provided me with ideas and inspiration. Our movement for democracy in Burma is firmly rooted in the principle of nonviolence that Gandhi made into an effective political force even against the most powerful opponents.
I might not be standing before you today as President of the United States had it not been for Gandhi and the message he shared and inspired with America and the world.